Hey everyone, welcome to the Steamboat Institute Facebook page. I'm Erica Anderson with Steamboat, and I'm talking today with Jillian Melchior. She is on the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal and a former Tony Blankley Fellow. So Jillian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we have been dying to talk with you for a long time about all the incredible reporting you've been doing out of Hong Kong. I think you've been there 4 times in the past year, just covering those protests. And so we would love to just get a little bit of a first-person account of what you've seen, what you've been reporting on. So let me just start by asking you, what drew you to reporting on the protests in the first place? And why do you think it's so important that there is this amount of coverage?
Well, what drew me to it, Hong Kong was actually the first place that I worked after college. I was a Bartley Fellow at the Wall Street Journal, and went out and just saw this beautiful city full of incredible people. And it was really sad, I think, this summer seeing that democracy, that sense of freedom and rule of law come under threat. So when 1 million people took to the streets in early June, I went to my editors and said, I want to cover this. I think this is a big deal. And they were fortunately willing to send me out there. But I think what's at stake here, I mean, it's not just important to Hong Kong. I mean, the United States should always stand with freedom-loving people. But in addition to that, I think Hong Kong is useful in that it shows that China does not live up to its international obligations. So under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which, well, to back up a little bit, I'll give you some history. Hong Kong used to be a British colony. And so when Britain was getting out of that game, it decided that it was going to hand that colony over to Great Britain. But it wanted to make sure that Hong Kong people still enjoyed freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, rule of law. So under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, this is an international agreement, Beijing essentially agreed that for 50 years, we're going to keep Hong Kong as part of China. It will be one country, but 2 systems. So they'll preserve their political and legal autonomy. So they're China, but not. This is a binding international agreement. But since then, we've seen China increasingly encroaching on those freedoms that Hong Kongers enjoy. And a couple of years ago, the Chinese government even came out and said that this obligation is no longer legally binding. So I think what we see here is that, you can't really take the Chinese government at its word. With these international obligations, it's not upholding them. And so maybe don't trust, but also verify.
Right. Yeah. And it's been pretty scary, or it looks pretty scary over there. You have had lots of pictures that were sort of graphic where people have gas masks and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of, it looks like somewhat violence, but screaming, commotion. Were you fearful at all going into that? And can you kind of describe what was it like being in the middle of the protests?
Yeah, it's definitely been a learning experience for me. I've covered protests before, but nothing quite like this. I actually landed in Hong Kong on June 12th, which was the first day that we saw real police violence. And that day was crazy. I pretty much landed at the airport, dropped my luggage off, and went straight out reporting. And what I saw that day was that there were a lot of peaceful protesters out there. They were opposing a piece of legislation that triggered these entire protests, which basically would have let the Chinese government put out a warrant for arrest for anyone in Hong Kong. And I mean, not just Hong Kong citizens, Hong Kong residents, but foreign business people there, even people stopping at the airport there. And what this extradition bill would have done is they could basically pick you up in Hong Kong and extradite you to mainland China, where you would face a Chinese system of justice, which we know is not a system of justice at all. We're talking about arbitrary detentions. We're talking about a country where sometimes political prisoners disappear. And so Hong Kongers rightly saw that as a huge threat to their legal autonomy. It would undo one country, 2 systems. And the day I landed, they were out protesting it, trying to block this bill from passing. And what I saw is a lot of young people peacefully protesting. Didn't see anyone engage in violence that day, but the police responded really violently. They started shooting tear gas into the crowd. And that was a bit of a shock to me. I would say I was not dressed or prepared for that. Got a bloody nose from it, but that's not the worst thing that happens. But yeah, basically people were just very alarmed by this. It's not what anyone expected, and retreated into this mall. So that was the starting point of the summer, of the police responding to peaceful protesters with tear gas, with rubber bullets, and with general violence and contempt for their right to assembly and their right to dissent. And since then, unfortunately, we've seen a pretty extreme escalation of that. There have been several instances where peaceful protesters have taken to the streets, and the police have responded in just this really violent way. And unfortunately, I think what we're starting to see in Hong Kong is a lot of people, because of that, feel like peaceful protest won't get results, feel like they have to defend themselves. And so it's become a cycle where every time you have an escalating level of police violence, you have protesters, a minority of them, who feel more justified in engaging in acts of vandalism, occasionally using force as a means of physical defense. But I think they lose some of their moral legitimacy when they do that, because the Chinese government has really tried to make the case that these are rioters, that the Hong Kong protesters are in some cases, they'll say, acting as terrorists. And that's not true. That's not reflective of what I've seen. I think we have to keep in mind this is a population of just over 7 million. One of the protests I attended, peaceful protests, 2 million people took to the streets. So we're talking about a huge portion of the Hong Kong population that has supported this freedom movement and done so in a peaceful fashion. Yet Beijing has used the actions of a couple of protesters who behaved in a disruptive or aggressive manner to tar the entire movement. And I think that's one of the more tragic developments.
And the bill that you were talking about, now that was stopped, right?
Yes, that was stopped. But by that point, I think this had grown into a much bigger issue, because it wasn't just about extradition at that point. It was about the complete lack of accountability. So you have an executive, a chief executive, which is the equivalent of like the president, who's not accountable to the people. It's not directly elected. It's appointed by Beijing, essentially, through this rigged system. You have a legislative council that, in the same way Beijing plays with it, rigs it, and controls the outcome. And then you have a police department that's completely unaccountable, that's using an astounding level of violence and force against people who are engaged in peaceful protest. So at that point, this had become a much bigger thing. Hong Kongers want accountability, and they also want universal suffrage. They want the right to be able to elect their chief executive and their legislative councillors. And that's something that they were actually promised in Hong Kong basic law, that eventually that would be the ultimate aim. But I think since then, we've seen Beijing really double down on its encroachments. It's saying, okay, we'll withdraw the extradition bill for now. But we'd like to in the future impose patriotic education in your schools so that your children are growing up indoctrinated with pro-Chinese Communist Party ideas. In addition to that, we want to have national security legislation that we've seen in Macau, the other special administrative region, is used to criminalize dissent, to criminalize protest. And these are things that Hong Kongers have taken to the streets in past decades and been able to defeat. So I think we've seen no indication whatsoever that the Chinese government is willing to back down. At the same time, you see protesters doubling down on their stance. And it's a really deep-rooted and dangerous standoff at this point.
So are people making predictions about what's ultimately going to happen? Is there sort of a more popular viewpoint on what will happen?
Well, last time I was there, which was last month, I was sad to notice a sort of, I wouldn't call it a sense of despair, but a sense of pessimism setting in, because I think a lot of people in Hong Kong are realizing that they're taking on the Chinese Communist Party alone, that this is an authoritarian government, that this is a government that in Xinjiang province has literally sent more than 1 million people to re-education camps where people are disappearing for political crimes. And I think there's a real sense of fear, a real fear of the consequences of the stand for freedom that they've taken there. I think if the government wanted an out, what it could do is start an independent investigation into the police conduct, which is one of the demands of the protesters. Universal suffrage, I doubt the Chinese government is going to agree to that, but they could at least move toward people electing more of their representatives. That would be something that would pacify a lot of the protesters. And the other demand of the protesters is to stop calling them rioters and to issue an amnesty to the thousands of people who've been arrested at this point. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but if you were the government and you were looking for a compromise, one thing you might consider is doing the independent investigation, finding some of the police officers that have engaged in the most egregious force, and then issuing a pardon to them at the same time that you issue a pardon to some of the protesters. So that would be the compromise deal, I guess. But at this point, we've seen no indication whatsoever that the government intends to compromise. In fact, we've seen every indication that it continues to crack down on Hong Kong and be more aggressive. So I think we can expect the protests to continue and this to be a stalemate for quite some time, and that the stakes are incredibly high. This is a dangerous situation.
So when you're going in there, you've been 4 times. I think I'm wondering, and maybe others are wondering, how do you find the story? Because you're going to find the story within the story. And so what's sort of your process as a journalist to, find those little pieces of life that you're going to, bring back to us in the Wall Street Journal?
Oh, well, I'm so thankful that I've gotten to meet so many incredible Hong Kongers. One thing that I think is interesting right now is there is a real sense of solidarity and purpose in Hong Kong, even if there is this sort of sense of fear. And so, yeah, people have been really willing to share contacts with me, to make introductions, to speak out on this. And I think they've been really courageous in many cases, showing their faces and using their names. So, I've gone out there and interviewed a lot of protesters, a lot of human rights lawyers that are standing up for protesters who've been arrested and charged in a pretty flimsy or questionable way. And then also a lot of political activists. And I think what's so incredible about this movement right now is, in the past, when there have been protests in Hong Kong, most notably in the umbrella movement, this was a youth movement. It was a lot of college students, a lot of high school students. What you're seeing now is that it's everyone in society. When you go see these protests, when you attend them and start reporting on them, you do see college students, but you also see grandmothers out walking together saying that this is our obligation to the next generation. You see disabled people, you see civil servants. I mean, literally business people, everyone in society is coming out and supporting this movement and doing what they can for it. So for me as a reporter, that means that there are just a lot of people to talk to and a lot of people who have really interesting stories of courage to share.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they would want to talk to you and get the story out there even wider. So I'm guessing you're going to be going back probably at some point and continuing to cover things as they move along.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm kind of waiting for the next big event out there, and I'm not sure what that's going to be. When this protest movement broke out in June, it was so focused on the extradition bill. Then you saw the extradition bill put on pause and withdrawn. By then, the movement had expanded. The goal was to keep it going until October 1st, which was the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It blew through that deadline. In November, they had district council elections, which are kind of like city council elections. Most of the power is symbolic, but it's the one post in Hong Kong that people can directly elect. So you saw this huge momentum toward that, for people to come out and vote for pro-democratic candidates to keep the movement alive until then. We've now blown past that deadline. And I think the question now is, in September, they're going to have elections for the limited minority portion of legislative councilors. So I'll be keeping an eye on how that goes, but that's quite a few months out. And I think the potential for this to escalate or for something interesting to happen, we'll just see. I'm not really sure where the story is going next.
All right. Well, Jillian, thank you so much for giving us a little peek inside your life. We will be following all of your work, of course, and making sure that we get it out there. And everyone watching, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.